Hello and welcome to Oxford Analytica's Daily Briefing. I'm Stephanie Hare, Senior Analyst for Western Europe, and I'm in conversation today with Dr. Tom Wales, our Director of Analysis. Tom, thank you for joining us today. We are in conversation to discuss the revelations that broke out last week about Edward Snowden, the ex-CIA employee and former National Security Agency contractor, who revealed via leaks to the Guardian newspaper here in the United Kingdom and the Washington Post in the United States, revelations about the extent to surveillance activities by the U.S. government using U.S. telecoms companies and U.S. internet service providers, social media sites, and companies such as Apple, which produce, well, pretty much everything. So, Tom, to what extent is this actually new?
Well, it's not new at all. These activities have been going on for years. They were legally authorized back in 2007, 2008 as a result of several acts of Congress. The most important one was the revisions to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which actually dates from 1979, but it was brought at least somewhat up to speed in terms of the internet age at that point in 2007. What this involves, what this act allows is two things. One is it allows warrantless, that is, you don't need a judicial warrant, surveillance of internet traffic or telecommunications traffic. That doesn't allow reading or probing specific communications, but it does allow you to gauge the amount of data that's going between one individual and another. These are things like phone logs. They're things like email traffic, all internet traffic in terms of data that's being sent from one location to another. And this has covered millions of people, but is directed almost entirely abroad, according to General Alexander, the head of the NSA. I think we can at least somewhat believe this because this is confirmed by the leaks in The Guardian. That is, quite a lot of it involves surveying U.S. citizens' data inside the United States if the traffic is partly foreign. Right. A little bit of it seems to involve citizen-to-citizen traffic. But one must make a very important distinction, and this is a distinction that's been elided or completely ignored in the media, between surveying traffic and surveying specific communications or opening specific communications. I mean, the analogy is keeping track of the number of letters that go from one jurisdiction to another as opposed to opening the mail.
Right.
In order to actually access the communication, you need to get a judicial warrant from a judge that sits on the so-called Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. This is a secret court in the sense that its proceedings are secret, although as of a ruling actually a couple days ago, its decisions are not necessarily secret. So one of the things that Snowden leaked was actually a ruling by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court on one of these authorizations for wiretapping. But I think fundamentally, before we talk about the corporate implications as well as the political implications, what's going on here is that there's sort of a confusion or a difficulty that all involved, including the public, have distinguishing public information and private information in the internet age. A lot of people think that metadata, which is what this program primarily captures, the NSA program PRISM is the code name that was used by The Guardian, is metadata. So by metadata, we don't mean the specific contents of information, but patterns of information flow, usage, this sort of thing. To use another analogy, it's a bit like, following metadata is a bit like the cops tailing somebody who they view as suspicious, as opposed to actually searching their car or searching their home, which would require a judicial warrant. Metadata is not just involved in usage of the internet or usage of mobile phones, or not just generated by these activities, but actually it's associated with a lot of the realities of modern life. So for instance, in the United States, if you go through an automated toll like Easy Pass in New York, the system will record that you, or rather your car, drove through that particular toll at a particular point in a particular time. States and federal authorities keep track of some of this traffic, partly for law enforcement purposes, partly for commercial purposes, and they don't view it as retention of private data. They view this as public data. So the problem is that many corporations, and this includes most major internet firms, view metadata as public data, and data, moreover, that they can try and monetize. Many of them have built this use of metadata into their business models. This is how they make money. And the government has tended to regard metadata, and certainly the NSA, for the purposes of this program, has tended to regard metadata as public. But most ordinary people, when they're asked about this sort of thing, tend not to view metadata this way. They tend to assume that it's private. That assumption is false, but it's one that's been opened up and kind of exposed to the light of day by this whole program and the revelations that it entails. Now, in terms of the political implications in the United States, there are going to be very few of them, very few to none. The people who opposed the FISA revision, that is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act revision, and Patriot Act reauthorization in 2011, which also included the FISA revision, still oppose this kind of activity in this sort of system. However, a majority in Congress are broadly in favor. The public is also broadly in favor, if you believe the polls. So 2/3 of people think that for national security purposes in the United States, the government should be allowed to conduct activities sort of like this. In a New York Times poll earlier this week, a bare majority, about 51%, said that they supported the kind of activity conducted for the purposes of this particular program. I think that a lot of the public still doesn't make a distinction between metadata mining, which is what this activity really involved primarily, and opening emails, which is what a lot of the public thinks the government is doing. I'm afraid to say that the NSA, even with its supercomputers and its tens of thousands of employees, doesn't have nearly the resources to open everyone's mail, even if it wanted to. So that's, I think, where the situation lies in terms of the U.S. I think we need to talk about two things, though, in the remainder of this video, and you're the real expert on these. They are, first, what does this mean for corporations, particularly big tech, so-called, in the United States, that use metadata as part of their ordinary business models? Many of them are desperately trying to separate themselves from this government program or from association with the program, despite the fact that their models revolve around mining their customers' data. And secondly, what does it mean for EU-US relations and the treatment of these companies' businesses in Europe, which is where quite a lot of them, Google for one, earn a substantial share of their profits. So let's talk let me ask you first, what do you think the implications are for these big tech firms?
I think the implications are huge. One of the things that's so striking, I think, in all of this is not just the big tech firms, but we saw, Booz Hamilton, the consultancy that was involved that employed Snowden. We have seen other companies that are engaged in cloud computing, like IBM and now Amazon, which most people think about in terms of buying their books online. Well, they're making huge bids to do cloud computing for the CIA. So suddenly we're seeing, I think, a very interesting mix of some of the biggest US companies and government intelligence agencies, just government agencies anyways, and I think those are going to get mixed up in a lot of people's minds with their own personal data. So perhaps it's sort of I don't know, maybe it's not the end of privacy, maybe it's the end of naivete. Maybe we're all going to have to become much more sophisticated about what we put online, how it's being used, and informing ourselves of what actually is legal. So I think you're absolutely right that there is this mistrust, and the mistrust in the government, which goes back to practices under the previous administration with warrantless wiretapping, which made people very nervous and obviously had to be stopped. That's what's kind of created this suspicion that this could be happening. They could be accessing our data. And how do you prove that they aren't? Where is the trust? And once trust is broken, it's very difficult to restore. So I think there's that. That's the real challenge for the corporations, is how can they demonstrate that they are simply complying with the law? and it's US law. So that raises two questions. First of all, can they publish a transparency report, which many of them want to do, saying this is the number of times that we are asked to provide this metadata, or to allow people to even have access to, to emails for security reasons when a warrant has been requested. But also, can we break it down so that we can show how these requests are made by geographic region in the world? Now, it'll be very interesting to see if that happens. What's really interesting is that we're seeing sort of the government wants to have access to our data, but will there be this reaction of allowing us to have access to the government's data or access to the company's data to see how this dynamic is playing? I think that's the one question that's raised. And the second, of course, is that American citizens might be reassured by these explanations that, we're mostly targeting foreigners and traffic between Americans and foreigners. But as you just rightly raised, these are global companies. They may be domiciled in the United States, created in the United States, but many of their shareholders, many of their users, many of their growth markets are outside the United States. And that brings us to the European Union question. So, as you know, we are expecting to see some very far-reaching data protection legislation in the EU passed in 2014. That has already been the subject of huge lobbying by some of the firms in question, namely Google, namely Facebook. We're seeing a lot of the European member states pushing back on this. Some of them have very deeply held values about privacy, this concept that is absolutely foreign to us now called the right to be forgotten, the right that you own your data and can have it expunged from the internet if you wanted to. This is an absolute nightmare for the corporations and a nightmare for the security agencies, but it's something that the EU is seeking to enshrine in law. So you can see a real tension there between the civil liberties angle, the government security angle, and the corporations angle seeking to profit from data. So that's going to be the big question, is really who will win this power play. I think the next really 6 to 12 months in Europe will be absolutely huge, because we'll need to see if there are pushback from citizens groups, member states, governments, the European Parliament, and the European Commission on this, and what sort of diplomatic overtures they can make both with the United States government and these US companies to gain assurances, guarantees for the privacy of US citizens as well as EU citizens. That's the thing, is that it's not acceptable to have a sort of two-tier system whereby US citizens are guaranteed certain privacy rights with their data, but EU citizens are denied these rights. And I think that raises this corporate foreign policy issue that we've been following for 2 years now really closely, and puts it in a totally new ballgame. It's going to be absolutely fascinating.
Now, as usual, when we discuss the EU, it's hard to make an effective generalization because, of course, as you say, there's some countries, and you mentioned Finland before, that take a very hard line on privacy and are extremely upset about the revelations that appeared in The Guardian.
Right. And Germany, of course, too.
And Germany, for instance. And then, on the other hand, there are countries like the UK, where the government has basically come out and said, well, the government obeys the law, GCHQ obeys the law, and otherwise, we're not interested in discussing anything about this program.
Absolutely. So there's completely different perspectives, and that's also informed again by these different national contexts. I mean, here in the United Kingdom where we are based, we have CCTV camera everywhere. Everywhere. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that people like it. It just means that we put up with it.
Far more than in the US, for the benefit of our US viewers. Yeah. Compared to the United States, security cameras here are ubiquitous.
Exactly. Whereas in Germany, not just with the experience that they had during the Second World War, but also under the Stasi regime in Eastern Germany, it's a very different reaction and powerful backlash against state surveillance, and a real understanding, I think, of the absolute worst case scenario of where that could lead. And nobody's saying that that's what's happening in the United States right now, but it is the reason I think that you're seeing a lot of the perhaps fear-mongering or sensitivities about it, as well as very legitimate concerns about what is being done, we keep saying, in our name. It raises really interesting questions of democracy. So how do you protect the values of liberal democracies during threats such as war or terrorism? How do you get that balance right between security and civil liberties?
Well, particularly, and that's particularly relevant in the context of new technology. One observation that several of our contributors have made, and several people that I know have made, is the fact is that in terms of the way some of these internet companies follow our activities on the web and make use of metadata, it may not be as broad, except in the case of a few of these companies that have that kind of penetration as the NSA program, but it's certainly a lot deeper. In other words, the amount of data that they collect on us and the depth of that information greatly exceeds anything that the government has. So there you go, and that could explain why they're so eager to prove that they haven't cooperated nearly as much as some people fear.
Well, that's the irony, perhaps, of Snowden's revelations, is not necessarily what is new, but simply showing light on what is already happening. It's a sort of, if it's a victory for anything, perhaps it's a victory of just of transparency to make us all have this conversation and this dialogue, which we've discussed at Oxford Analytica has been happening piecemeal and over time among certain groups, but now it seems as though everyone is in a way forced to get on the same page and to make choices. There will obviously be ramifications that we'll no doubt discuss here in this video and in the Daily Brief in weeks to come.
Yep. Thank you very much for joining us. A key thing to highlight is that in our ongoing coverage, we'll cover this from the corporate side, but another question that's very important is how effective exactly is this kind of data mining as a national security / counterterrorism tool? Actually, most of the people that we talk to on the inside of the security establishment think it's very effective. Outside, there's far more skepticism. So we'll try to delve into that particular issue a bit more as well.
That's right, and it will be also the topic of one of our panels called Big Data at the Global Horizons Conference in autumn here at Christ Church, Oxford University. We look forward to seeing you then, and we'll see you for next week's video.